Now, when it comes to the Murex trunculus, the way we know it's the Murex trunculus is not because we are trying to interpret the simunim that the Gemara brings here. Because if we would try to interpret those simunim, then it's open to interpretation. One person can interpret it this way and someone can interpret it differently. So who's to say that it's necessarily correct the way we would interpret it? But it's different. The way we know is we start to try to see what does the word Chilazon mean? And that will point us in the right directions. Well, if a Chilazon has a meaning, if it's a word and it has a meaning, then whatever that means, that is something that we have to consider as being the source of the Chilazon, of the Tekhelet. That is the Chilazon. Additionally, we find other things which point directly. In other words, we're not going through simunim. We're going through means of where we find sources who directly point to this species and say, this is what we used for the Tekhelet. This is the Chilazon. So it's not something that's open to interpretation because it's been clearly identified. So the first means of identification is to know what the word Chilazon means. And again, because we say that the Chilazon, we have the only source, as we mentioned earlier, to say what the Tekhelet has to be is that it has to be from a Chilazon. So if we know the definition of the word Chilazon, which as I'll show you now, it means a snail, then we can conclude basically from this brayso that if something is a snail and it gives a dye, and the dye is the correct color, then it is kusha for Tekhelet, because that's the only t'nai that we find in Chazal. We don't have any other sources of halucha besides Chazal, and if Chazal only give us this one t'nai, this one rule, this one caveat of what the color's source has to be from, then we know that if we meet that criteria, then it's kusha. So anything which is a Chilazon and it produces the Tekhelet color would be kusha for Tekhelet. So how do I know that the word Chilazon means a snail? So there are lots of ways of knowing. First of all, we'll start with this. I mean, I'm not going in any particular order. All of the proofs are just as good. But when you have a multitude of proofs, it kind of proves it in a very conclusive way. Like it's not possible to dismiss it because it's just proven from all different angles. So there was somebody who was a Rishon, and he wrote a dictionary soon after the Rambam. He was born a couple of years after the Rambam was nifta, and he writes a dictionary to define the words that we find in the Rambam. And his name was Rabbi Yerushalmi. And under the entry Chilazon, he writes that it is the same as what is called in Arabic al-Chilazon. So in Arabic, the word al-Chilazon or Chilazon happens to mean a snail. The same way as in Assyriac, which is the modern Aramaic, to this very day, the word Chilazon means a snail. So the word Chilazon seems to mean a snail, unless you want to say that somehow the words, the language somehow changed over the years. But it's quite likely that the word Chilazon from this alone means a snail. We find in the Sefer Urach, there was somebody around 200 years ago who put in Yiddish touch into the entries of the Urach, and under the word Chilazon, he writes the word Schneck. Schneck is the word in Yiddish, in German, for snail. So he says that Chilazon is a snail. There's a Sefer Tviyas Uretz, which was also a little under 200 years ago. He defines the word choimet, which is a Lushan Kodesh word. He says it is al-Chilazon, and he says from there we know that the Chilazon of Tekhelet is a type of a choimet, and he writes it is a shnek, it is a snail. The Chilazon is a snail, he writes. He writes that the same thing we find, he uses the medrash that I mentioned earlier, that it says that the clothing grew together with the children. So he uses that as some sort of an indication that it must probably be the snail. But in any case, he says that from the fact that the word is Chilazon, which Chilazon means a shnek, a snail, so that's how we know that the Chilazon of Tekhelet is a snail. In the Perashah Mishnayos Rambam, there's a Mishnah in Kailim, it says, Shalsheles Shekusha Chilazon Beroisha Tamaye. You have a chain that they tied a Chilazon at one end. So it describes such a Chilazon. The Rambam in the Perush Mishnayos calls the Chilazon a tzadafa, which the word tzadafa means a seashell. So again, the word Chilazon is defined as being a creature which is in a seashell. Rashi in Avodah Zarah Daf Chuf Ches, there's the word Mishkideh Chalazoyne, where the word Chilazon is used. Rashi says limits, belaz. Limits is a French word, and it means a snail. I looked it up in an old French dictionary, the oldest dictionary I was able to find, which was from the 17th century. But if somebody doesn't want to necessarily rely on a dictionary, even though a dictionary is quite a good thing, but we also find the word limtze used by other Rishonim. And Rashi in Shabbos Daf Ayin Zayin, where it says shablil. Shablil is also a snail. It says Nepusik shablil temis yalach. The word shablil means a snail. And Rashi says limtze also, the same word, same French word. And Nagus Abach says limtze is a shnek, is a snail. So therefore we know that the word Chilazon, which is defined as meaning limtze or limits, means a snail. The word Chilazon is the same as shablil and choimet. We find the medrash that I mentioned earlier, it's quoted in Rashi. He brings the medrash. He says the medrash, as we look it up in our medrash that we have, it says Chilazon azeh. The Chilazon, as it grows, its levish grows with it, its clothing grows with it. Rashi brings it. He says a choimet. He exchanges the word Chilazon for the word choimet. The same medrash. He just uses a more familiar word. You have the Rosh. Perish Rosh al Torah, he uses the word shablil. Shablil and choimet and Chilazon is the same thing. You have the Sefer HaSherushim from Rabbi Yoine, Ben Janach maybe. This was a very early Rishon. He was about 1,000 years ago. Other Rishonim bring him. And under the entry Shin Bais Lamed, he brings the word shablil. And he says shablil is probably the same as Chilazon. So therefore, if we know what shablil is, which is a shnek, so we know Chilazon is a shnek. We have the Marie Koyen, which was a son-in-law of the Maral Miprag. On Medrash Tilim, he writes Chilazon choimet. Chilazon is a choimet, which is a snail. I already mentioned the Sefer Tvias Uratz, where he says choimet is a shnek. Rashi, he says choimet ani oime. It's a mean sheretz shekoyin limtze. Just in case, we want to see. The Bach says that the limtze is a snail, but Rashi says limtze is something which is gudal beklipe. It grows in a shell. It goes in circles around and around as much as it grows. Kol kamish gudal. So again, we have the Radak that on the word choimet, he says choimet is a sheretz which is called limtze. He says the word shablil also means a limtze. So whenever we find the word limtze in the Rishonim, as I mentioned, in the Rabbi Gershon, in B'choires Daf Lamed Ches, says Chilazon is a limits. So therefore we know that the word limtze is the same as a choimet, it's a snail. So from all of these proofs, we know that the word choimet is a snail. There are more proofs. That's going to come soon. Those are more conclusive proofs, which are in direct referring to the Chilazon of the Tekhelet. But here I'm just referring in general to the word Chilazon, which means a snail. It's hard to say different after you see all of these sources that the word Chilazon means a snail. So the word Chilazon means a snail. So here we have a snail, which we know was used as a dye, and it does serve. It can be used as a dye. It has a dye in it. It can make the Tekhelet. It makes the Tekhelet color, and we can dye wool with it. And it's kusha for Tekhelet because that's what the Tosefta says. And Tekhelet is einig shayre min Chilazon. That is the only prerequisite. It's the only t'nai that we have to say what Tekhelet has to be. There is more, and that is that we have Gedolim who actually said clearly that the Murex has another name. It's also called Pilpira. Pilpira is an old Greek word. It was already mentioned earlier in this event by some of the other speakers. It means the Murex we find in some of the works of the older Chachmei Imis Oilam, Aristotle and Pliny. The word Pilpira is used interchangeably with the word Murex. It's the same thing. We find even today the word Pilpira is used in some places where they still use the a murex snail to dye. I recently found out there's a place in South America called Oaxaca, and they actually do still dye with the dye that comes out of a murex, and they call it purpura. So obviously the word purpura is the same as the word murex. That's the same thing. And the purpire is something that it's a word that has not gotten lost over the generations. It's something that's been used throughout history, and it continues to mean the same thing to this very day. And it means a snail. It means a murex snail. Now we have Gedoyla Kadmoinim. We have the Shilta Geboirim, which was a cipher that gets quoted by Toisus Yontif, some places, and other Gedolim. He was in Shinai Bais over 400 years ago. He writes that he talks about he says, Belushin Yuvon, Remes Hayom, Hanikre Pirper. There is a creature of the sea which is called Pirper. Vehi HaChaluzon Shetzoivim Boit Chayles. That is the Chaluzon that we died Chayles out. You have the Teyafis Ra'aim, which is a parish on the Yerayim from the year Tufreishni Bais, and he writes the Chaluzon, the HaChaluzon Shetzoivim Bedomit Chayles, Nikre Chaluzon Adoimi Pirper Shneke. The Chaluzon that we died Chayles is called Chaluzon Adoimi. It's Pirper Shneke, the Pirpire snail. Shamshel Fungel Hirsch used the same word Pirper Shneke when he on the Pusi Kishefa Yamam Yunuk, he talks about the Chaluzon, which was in the Chaylik of Zvilin, and he said it's called, the Chaluzon is called Pirper Shneke, the Pirper snail. The Yavitz, the Rabbi Yankiv Emden, he brings some of the things from the Chachmei Masoilim, from the historians, from the Goyish historians, in connection to the Tzaida, the capturing of the Chaluzon, and he writes that this Chaluzon was found. The same as our Gemara Masechtes Shabbos says that the Nevizaradon left over Yidden to create dye out of the Chaluzon, in order to create Malbishim for the king, and in those areas, that's where that's where the Chachmei Masoilim write that that's the source of the Chaluzon. Chaylis was made over there, and Rabbi Yankiv Emden says that to which the historians, the history books, the Goyish history books refer, that is the same as the Chaluzon of the Chaylis. The same thing is in the Radal, in his parish in Pirkei Rabbi Lezer, where he also writes the same thing, that the Purpira is the same thing that the Chachmei Masoilim talk about, and that's the Chaluzon of the Chaylis. Additionally, we have a Chavas Yuir, who was one of the very earlier Achroinim, and he writes the Dam Chaluzon Sheboit Soivim Chaylis, the blood of the Chaluzon, out of which we dyed Chaylis. I know blue. It's not blue, Raktseva Pirper. It's the color purple. I guess he means purple. Shenase midam dog shenikra hadam pirper. It's made out of a type of a sea creature, which is called pirper. So he's saying that the actual blood, the actual secretion as it comes out isn't blue, even though the final product of the Chaylis is blue, but the blood of the Chaluzon isn't blue. It starts off as being purple, as we had already seen earlier in this event where some of the previous speakers spoke about that and showed how originally when it comes out of the Chaluzon it's purple, and then later through the correct process of processing the Tchailis, it gets its correct color of Tchailis, of blue. So you have the Chavas Yuri who identifies it. He says it's purple, and he even describes a little bit of the process, and when it comes out the blood isn't blue, it starts off as purple. We have the Ramban ala Teure, which he doesn't say beferish, but it seems to be a good indication. He says in Parashat Tetzaveh, where the Torah mentions Tchailis, he says that Tchailis, until this very day, nobody would dare to wear it except for the Melech Goyim. And we know that the Ramban in other parts of the Torah, he said Melech Goyim refers to the Melech Roimi. It's known that there was exile, there was a decree against a person who's not of royalty to wear a garment that's dyed with Tchailis. It was reserved only for royalty, and there were times that it was even punishable by death if somebody else would try to wear Tchailis. So the Ramban says that there's Tchailis, even to this very day, I guess even in his time, there was the Byzantine Empire, which continued not to allow people to wear Tchailis. It was reserved for the royalty. So it seems to be an indication. He says it's something which is reserved for the Melech Goyim. So I guess he's referring to that. But in any case, all of these other sources besides the Ramban are much clearer, where they directly point to that which the Chachmei Masoilim refer, and they directly say that that is the Chaluzon of the Tchailis, and it's called Pirpira. So, in this sense, it's not similar at all to the way the Radzina Rebbe identified the Chaluzon. Over here, we're identifying it because the word Chaluzon means a snail, and this is a snail. So it's directly identified. It's not identified through a siman, through some sort of a proof. It's identified because it's been pinpointed and described as what it is. The same is with all of these achronim that I mentioned. They clearly say that the Chaluzon Atchailis is the Pilpira. So it's not a siman, it's somebody directly identifying and saying this is what it is. So that's conclusive. It doesn't leave any room for ambiguity. There's no suffix here. There's no room to say maybe we can interpret things differently. There's no interpretation. It's a direct identification of what the Chaluzon is. Therefore, nobody could say that the Chaluzon is not the Pirpira, because if he would do so, he would be arguing on all of these Gedolim. And there's no reason to argue. It seems that that's what it is from, it's the conclusion, the logical conclusion that anyone would come to. But even if a person would think differently, who has the authority to argue with all of these Gedolim, Yisroel, the Chavas Yuah, and Rabbi Yankiv Emden, all of the ones that I mentioned? And one might say, well, maybe, there are other achronim who maybe say differently. There aren't any other achronim. There's nobody else who identified the Chaluzon as being anything else besides the Pilpira, except for the Radzina. And the Radzina was clearly, disproven, and the Gedolai Zmanoi did not agree with him. So besides that, nobody else gave any other identity for the Chaluzon. And here you have a Gedolai Kadmoinai achronim who say what it is. So that's it. So therefore, that is the Chaluzon. So that's how we know that the Murex trunculus is a kosher source for Tekhelet, the kosher source or a kosher source for the Tekhelet.